Hello and a very warm welcome to Insight. I am Amandra Bhatt. Today we talk about expectations from the upcoming BRICS summit. Prime Minister Narendra Modi is in Brazil to attend the 6th summit of the BRICS grouping of nations, that is Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. On the agenda is the inauguration of a development bank which is going to look after the funding needs of developing emerging economies. Mr. Modi will also, of course, hold talks with many world leaders there, and the bilateral between India and China is going to be, of course, of special significance to us. Today in Insight, we discuss what India hopes to achieve through the BRICS summit and what has this grouping of 5 emerging economies achieved so far. And to talk about the BRICS summit, we are joined in our studios by 3 distinguished guests. Please welcome Professor Sreeram Chaulia. He is a professor and dean in the General School of International Affairs. Welcome to Insight, Professor Chaulia. Professor Chaulia, I'd like to begin with you. Let's begin with the relevance of BRICS, this grouping of 5 emerging economies: Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. We understand this term was coined over a decade ago by Jim O'Neill, who was a Goldman Sachs economist. South Africa, of course, came in much later, and this was used to refer to a group of emerging economies who had this high economic growth potential. Do you think it's still relevant in today's context, given the fact that most of these economies have slowed down?
Yeah, I mean, if you take out China and look at the average growth of the other 4, it's hovering around 2 or 3% only. But nonetheless, I mean, their size, their populations, again, Russia is an exception, which is the declining population, but all the others have relatively large territorial entities with large populations. All of them have aspirations for changing the international order and the international structure and making it more democratic. All of them want a more multipolar world. So these are binding factors which make them still relevant, because that quest for distributing power more evenly in the world has not gone away, even though the growth miracles have faltered a little bit. And I think with structural reforms, some of these countries are going to bounce back pretty strongly in the next 5 to 10 years. So you can't rule them out. But where BRICS is limited is in terms of, it has to be BRICS plus. There are many other emerging economies. If you look at Columbia University's list of emerging market economies, there are 18 countries, out of which BRICS are only 5. Right? So I think the concept of emerging economies is not going to die out, because growth will be variegated depending upon demographic conditions and the policy environment in different countries. More and more countries are going to jump onto this bandwagon of being emerging or rising fast. So I think we can't dismiss them saying that they are now passé. What we have to see is how do we expand the BRICS, and some of these initiatives include involving capital from other emerging economies, like this proposed bank. So that's an exciting prospect that we're going to go now to BRICS plus. But of course, BRICS, the core 5 countries need to also find consensus on many issues.
Right.
It's been slow in the coming, so we have had problems. But overall, I would say it is a formidable grouping, and it should not be seen as somehow outdated just because the concept was coined some time ago. I think it will still have relevance, and they have found some cohesion now after 5 summits.
So you don't think this grouping has lost its sheen?
No, I think, see, what's going to happen is people say Russia is a misnomer here because it's not really happening and it's a fossil fuel based economy. It doesn't have long-term growth prospects. But overall, if you see, I mean, if you add up their net strengths, I think it still poses a formidable block of countries. It's not really a military kind of alliance.
But speaking of Russia, Russia used to be that link between the West, the G8 economies and the emerging economies. But Russia too is faced with sanctions now.
Yeah, but nonetheless, I mean, think about it. Russia is actually ideologically the strongest of all the BRICS countries insofar as they want to counterbalance the West, clearly. The Chinese are wishy-washy about it and the rest are not. So I think Russia provides a lot of ideological leadership, and they place a lot of emphasis on BRICS because for them, BRICS is a kind of a fallback option because of the ostracization by the West. So increasingly Asian economies, Latin American economies, African ones, Russia is seeing itself more and more as a Eurasian power than as European or in any way a part of the G8. So I think they don't mind even being out of the G8, because for now they are looking at more connectivity with the rest of the BRICS and other emerging economies. So I think overall it's still a cohesive group. They have a kind of a commitment to a new world order, and this development bank is the first step towards
Oh, let me bring Professor Chaulia in
I
here.
think it's a bit, also a bit of semantics here, because while you're challenging an American-led order, you don't say it. That's politically incorrect, That also often happens. I mean, even President Putin, who's like paranoid about America and American interference, and in fact, he has cut down most of his economic bridges with the Americans. In fact, Russia is the least connected of all the BRICS economies with the United States, and can afford to be very hostile and antagonistic to the US.
Right.
Russia, so here even he talks about working with the American partners and so on. And
even countries like Brazil, they are miffed with reports of the,
with the
NSA spying.
Sure.
Yeah.
In fact, President Roosevelt even cancelled her state visit to the US. So yes, so these things are there. But at the end of the day, the question is the ground is shifting, and what BRICS are supposed to be doing is to make that change happen, and to make it. So in a way, we cannot imagine any other set of 5 or 6 or 10 countries, for example, that can have the stature to even talk about changing the order. So in that sense, we are doing, and it's not only now we are walking the talk with all these new concrete institutions that are coming up. So it's clear that the West, whether or not we are anti-US is one question, but we are certainly changing the Western ordained world order. So you can argue that individual states are not the target here, or their power, but rather what we are doing is we are attenuating the ecosystem within which certain states had dominated. So indirectly, yes, it does undermine Western interest.
Professor Chaulia, I'll continue with you. There has been a lot of criticism that this grouping has failed to come up with concrete institution creating results. It's not very time bound in its goals. Now of course there is this developmental bank that's going to be inaugurated very soon. But do you think this grouping has actually broken any new ground or forged any new initiatives that will make an impression in the emerging global system and make it more equitable and sustainable?
Yeah, I see. It takes time. I mean, think about it. The EU, after the end of the Cold War, the EEC was converted into the EU. It took them 10 years for introducing the common currency, the Maastricht Treaty. So the euro actually came about only in 2000, a good 10 years after they had initially envisioned it. So sorting out differences and ego tussles, which are more understated publicly but do exist within the member countries, all these need time. Even, for example, the so-called struggle over where the headquarters of the bank is going to be,
right,
and how much seed capital each country should contribute. Because if you go by proportion of GDP, then China will swamp everybody else. Initially, there were suspicions that even though India had originated the idea of the bank, that the Chinese are going to now use it as a Trojan horse to, dominate the, the multilateral lending system through kind of a BRICS bank. All that has come to naught now. I think the Chinese have also shown to some extent deference to the fears of the smaller BRICS member countries now, because they realize that BRICS cannot just be an instrument of Chinese interests. It has to be based on common points where all of us agree. So I think it has made. I mean, the bank is there. Then there is this Contingency Reserve Fund, which is being officially announced at Fortaleza. So and then there are other things. Russia wants to set up an energy initiative, because there are 2 member countries which have a lot of surplus energy, while there are 3 which buy more oil and gas. So it's a unique grouping. In that sense, they could work out some kind of predictable mechanism that can buffer, for example, China, India, and South Africa from the fluctuations of the global oil market, which is dependent on the Middle East. It can make a huge difference for our growth. So in a sense, we are saying that in the era of globalization, as we know, we have also created these pockets or clubs that are also dealing a lot within themselves, because there's no truly universal free movement of goods or capital going on right now. They're all been broken up. So BRICS is one such. It's an inter-regional body across continents, and we are saying that we are going to solidify our own defenses so that we don't become vulnerable to some of these global currents that are defined by the vagaries of the market, of the global market. So I think all that means that the system, the global system we're talking about, is not actually, strictly speaking, a truly globalized one, but one which is segmented. And BRICS is going to be one major segment that nobody can ignore.
Okay, Professor Chaulia, this is Prime Minister Modi's first big multilateral engagement since coming to power. What should be his focus there? Should the focus be on, ensuring a greater, bigger role for India, or countering the China threat?
No, I think this is not the kind of venue where we will be focusing on the bilateral threat posed by China. I think this is the venue where, it's like diplomacy is also broken into pockets. So where we have border disputes and strategic threats and encirclement, we deal with them in a different way. But here, we have to find what is common among all of us. And in fact, as you know, the bane of SAARC and other such regional groupings has been that we have often been trapped in bilateral hostilities. So here Modi, I think clearly Prime Minister is full of ideas, and I wouldn't be surprised if he proposes something new, some new concrete initiative. The Brazilians, interestingly, apparently have said that they are interested in developing a new statistical technique and method altogether, which would replace or at least be an alternative to what the OECD countries have been using to measure GDP and employment, inflation, all the macroeconomic indicators. So that would be a big, what we call an epistemological intervention. If BRICS can create a kind of a new measurement index with which you can also look at how development and all these things are happening. I'm sure Prime Minister may have other views about what else we could do together, which is joint. On the regional crises, I think it will be helpful, for example, if we have a designated lead point. For example, if there's a crisis in Mali, I mean, why do we need France to come and clean up the mess? I mean, it should be Nigeria, it should be South Africa, the regional power should be taking the lead, and the rest of the BRICS should be supporting these regional powers. If we don't want an American attack on Syria, which was the case last year, all of us said no attack. But what did we do apart from just issuing a communique?
Exactly.
So this is where, for example, why don't we send an investigation committee of our own with all the BRICS members and their diplomats to go and check out on facts on the ground whether the Syrian regime had used chemical weapons or not. We didn't do it. We sat back and, it was the IAEA and the Europeans who sent monitors and so on and collected their own biased evidence. So here, when there are all these interventions happening, neo-colonial disguised interventions, BRICS is opposed to them. But what does it mean to say we are opposed? People say, okay, stay opposed, but you're not doing anything, right? So I think Prime Minister should propose concrete means, be it Ukraine or Iraq or Syria or other burning crises around the world, that let us put forward proactive diplomacy where our diplomats and our political representatives, high representatives, are on the ground, working along with the UN, because all of us say we want to work with a multilateral, respectable UN thing rather than these mini coalitions that the Americans and the Europeans set up, right? So that is where I think BRICS has to has to cross new frontiers. And BRICS cannot be taken seriously if we, simply issue critiques and say we condemn this or we condemn that. That is a staccato, standard thing. Everybody does that. Here we have to now move into a new position where we say, okay, there's a BRICS delegation coming here. Okay, there's a BRICS initiative here to fund something that is, empowering local people. Okay, there's a BRICS statistical index that's changing our very notion and understanding of growth and development. That's where I think, and as I said before, it's not only BRICS, the emerging economies, we have to take them together. Our strength lies in unity of all these emerging powers.
Okay, a quick word, Professor Chaulia, before we wrap up on our engagement with the countries of Latin America. That's an area that's showing tremendous potential of growth. That's going to be an
nobody better than Narendra Modi to lead that, because the state of Gujarat accounted for 60% of India's total trade with Latin America under his chief ministership. And he knows the commercial potential there, especially in terms of trade and mutual investments on both sides. And I think now increasingly we're dependent on Venezuela for oil and so on as an alternative to the volatile Middle East. So Brazil itself is now acquired a lot of energy assets offshore. So increasingly for energy security as well as for our to cement our talk about the South-South cooperation, we cannot limit ourselves to Africa. We have to go beyond further and to Latin America. And now it's coming around because all of us have a similar conception that we have been, exploited in the past, and that we need to change the game.
So it can be an opportunity to look at allies in that part of the world.
Joseph Stiglitz has said that this new development bank is an idea whose time has come. And I think now with Latin America better integrated with Asia, We can, because Chavez had earlier created his own South-South Bank of the South. We need to link up all these initiatives to be able to change the world.
All right, well, I'm afraid I have to leave it at that. It's time for me to wrap up this discussion here. I'd like to thank all my guests for coming to the studios. It was a pleasure having you here. That's it for now in this edition of Insight. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.